Imagine stepping back to a time when a promise was sealed with a postage stamp. A whole new life bought and paid for, sight unseen. For some, it was the start of a dream in the vast, untamed American West. But for others, that dream could curdle into a nightmare before it even began, leaving them stranded, forgotten, and at the mercy of the elements. Then imagine, at your lowest moment, being found not by a kindly stranger, but by the one person the entire territory had learned to fear more than the summer storms or the winter snows. This is the story of a man who was thrown away, and the woman who was a ghost, and how they found a future in the ruins of their pasts. The year is 1881 in the high, lonesome country of the Colorado Rockies, where the rain falls hard and help is a long way off. May Lynn rode with the storm at her back, dressed head to toe in black oilcloth that shed the sheeting rain. From the wide brim of her Stetson to her worn leather boots, she was a moving piece of the night sky torn loose. Her horse, a powerful black gelding named Shadow, moved with a sure-footed grace that belied the treacherous, slick mud of the path. This was her territory. Every sharp-angled rock, every gnarled pine, every game trail that wound through the aspen groves was etched into her mind. She was a hunter, a trapper, a shadow in the high country, and for 3 years she had been a ghost. The bounty posters in far-off towns called her the Ghost of the Divide, a phantom gunslinger wanted for crimes she did not commit, a specter blamed for every bit of bad luck that befell the sprawling interests of Baron Alistair Finch. For May Lynn, survival was a solitary, relentless calculus of risk and reward. Today, the risk was the storm, a violent summer squall that had turned the creeks into roaring torrents. The reward was checking a line of snares she'd set for rabbits near the lower timberline. It was a routine she'd performed 100 times. But routine was a fragile thing in this land. It could be shattered in a heartbeat. As Shadow crested a low rise, May Lynn pulled him to a halt. Down on the rutted track that passed for a road, a figure was walking. Not riding. Walking in the teeth of the deluge, head bowed against the wind, a sodden scarecrow moving with the slow, agonizing persistence of a man with no other choice. This was wrong. No one walked this road. Not unless they were desperate, or foolish, or both. Her hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker holstered on her hip, its walnut grip smooth and familiar against her palm. She was not a woman given to charity, and strangers were a danger she could not afford. Yet, she watched. The man stumbled, righted himself, and kept going, clutching a small, square wooden box to his chest as if it held the last bit of warmth in the world. He was heading away from civilization, deeper into the wilderness, deeper into her world. May Lynn urged Shadow forward, the horse's hooves making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. She approached the man from the side, keeping a deliberate distance, her presence announced by the creak of her saddle leather. He didn't seem to notice until she was almost upon him. When he finally looked up, his face was a pale blur in the gray light, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He was young, perhaps her age, with eyes that held a shocking depth of exhaustion. He wasn't a cowboy or a miner. His frame was leaner. His hands, though chapped and red from the cold, looked like they had never known the bite of an axe or the heft of a pick. He simply stared at her, a strange mix of fear and resignation in his gaze. "You're a long way from anywhere, mister." May Lynn's voice was low, rough from disuse, carrying easily over the drumming rain. "Town's a 2-day walk back the way you came. Nothing ahead but mountains." The man flinched at the word town. He swallowed, his throat working. "There is nothing for me in town," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, with the clear, educated cadence of the East. "I was told to walk, so I am walking." He hugged the wooden box tighter. It was a simple pine crate, but it was well made, with dovetailed joints. Maylin's gaze narrowed. Told by who? She had a very good idea. The only power in this valley that could cast a man out with such casual cruelty belonged to one person. The man's shoulders slumped. The foreman for the Ellingtons. I was expected. He said the word as if it tasted like ash. A mail-order arrangement. A mail-order husband. Maylin had heard of such things. Women from the East, answering advertisements from lonely men on the frontier. But this was the reverse. A man, summoned and then discarded. They took one look at me, he continued, his voice devoid of self-pity, stating it like a fact from a ledger. Said they needed a man who could break a horse, not one who could bind a book. They gave me $10 and pointed me down this road. He didn't have to say the name of the man who owned the Ellingtons' ranch and everything else for miles around. Baron Finch. It was his brand of cruelty. Leaving a man to the mercy of the elements was a message. Maylin felt a familiar, cold knot of anger tighten in her gut. She looked at the sky, then back at the man. He was shivering, his lips tinged with blue. He wouldn't last another hour. Leaving him was a death sentence. But helping him was a risk that could unravel the solitary, dangerous peace she had carved out for herself. He was a loose end, a tie to the world she had fled. But as she looked at him, she didn't see a threat. She saw a reflection of her own past, another soul discarded by the same indifferent power that had shattered her own life. You walk any further, you'll be dead by sundown, she said, her tone flat. My cabin's not far. You can wait out the storm. The man, Thomas Cole, looked at her, then at the endless, hostile wilderness around them. He had no choice, and they both knew it. I don't have anything to pay you with, he said, his pride a thin, stubborn thread. Maylin just shook her head. I ain't asking for pay. She nudged Shadow closer. Can you ride? He nodded mutely. She offered a hand down to him. It was a long moment before he took it. His hand was cold, but his grip was firm. Pulling him up to sit behind her on the saddle, she could feel the tremors running through his body. He was little more than dead weight. As they rode, he held on to the back of her saddle, careful not to touch her, his precious box balanced on his lap. The quiet between them was broken only by the storm and the steady rhythm of the horse's gait. The cabin was nestled in a tight valley, shielded from the wind by a thick stand of lodgepole pines and a sheer granite cliff face. It was almost invisible until you were right upon it. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the dark, oppressive sky. To Thomas, it looked like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Maylin slid from the saddle with fluid grace and gestured for him to dismount. He did so stiffly, his limbs numb and clumsy. Get inside, she ordered, already moving to unsaddle Shadow and lead him into a small, sturdy lean-to. Thomas stumbled toward the door, pushing it open. The interior was a single room, Spartan and impeccably clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the log walls. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and shelves holding tins, jars, and neatly folded pelts lined the other side. It was a space built for pure function, for survival. And hanging from wooden pegs beside the fireplace were the tools of that survival: a Winchester rifle, a shotgun, and a gun belt holding 2 identical Colt revolvers in worn leather holsters. The sight of them sent a fresh chill through him, one that had nothing to do with the cold. When Maylin entered, shaking the rain from her hat, she saw him staring at the guns. She didn't say a word, simply walked over and unbuckled the gun belt she wore, hanging it on an empty peg next to the others. The action was casual, practical, but it felt like a statement. This is who I am. This is the world you have entered. "There's a blanket on the cot," she said, her back to him as she stoked the fire. "Get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." He did as he was told, stripping off his soaked jacket and shirt with fumbling fingers. His body was racked with shivers. As he wrapped the coarse wool blanket around his shoulders, she turned, a steaming tin cup in her hand. She passed it to him. It was coffee, black and brutally strong. The heat seeped into his hands, a small miracle of warmth. He noticed then a scar on the back of her hand, a pale, puckered mark near her knuckles. It was an old burn, shaped almost like a stylized letter F. He looked away quickly, feeling like he had seen something he shouldn't have. He sat on one of the chairs, his wet clothes in a heap on the floor, his wooden box placed carefully beside him. He was a stranger in a wanted woman's home, a liability. "I can work," he said, the words coming out hoarser than he intended. "For my keep. I am not strong, but I am a quick study. My trade was bookbinding." Mei Lin glanced at his hands, then back at his face. "Not much call for that up here," she said, but there was no mockery in her voice. "You can chop wood when the rain stops. For now, just try not to die on my floor." She took a piece of jerky from a pouch and began to chew on it, her movements economical and precise. She was watching him, her dark eyes assessing every detail. He felt like a specimen under glass. To break the silence, he looked down at his own arm, where a long, jagged scar ran from his wrist to his elbow, a memento from a childhood fall through a glass window. For some reason, seeing her scar had made him conscious of his own. They were two people marked by their pasts, thrown together by a storm. The stakes were clear. For him, it was immediate survival. For her, his presence was a complication that could cost her everything. The rain hammered against the roof, a relentless drumbeat isolating them from the rest of the world. The cabin, which had at first seemed a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The storm did not break. For 3 days the rain fell in a solid gray sheet, turning the world outside into a watercolor blur. The valley was sealed. Inside the cabin, a tense and fragile truce settled between them. Thomas, true to his word, tried to make himself useful. His first attempt at splitting firewood was a disaster. The axe felt alien and clumsy in his hands, and he succeeded only in bruising his shins and earning a flat, unimpressed look from Mei Lin. She took the axe from him without a word, and with a few powerful, efficient swings, produced a neat pile of kindling. Defeated, he found other ways to earn his keep. He was meticulous. He noticed the stitching on one of her leather saddlebags was coming loose, and, using a small kit of tools from his own box, he repaired it with a neat, almost invisible seam. He sharpened her skinning knives until they had a razor's edge. He organized the jumble of maps on her table, sorting them by region and scale. He was quiet, unobtrusive, and deeply aware that he was a guest living on borrowed time. Mei Lin watched him. She was used to solitude, had courted it in fact. His presence was a constant, low-level disturbance, like a stone in her shoe. But he was not what she expected. He did not complain. He did not ask prying questions. He simply existed, his quiet industry a stark contrast to the violent world she inhabited. One afternoon, while she was cleaning her rifle, she glanced over and saw that he had taken a small, leather-bound journal and a stick of charcoal from his box. He was sketching, his head bent in concentration, his hand moving with a fluid certainty that was absent when he held an axe. Curious, she moved silently to stand behind him. He was drawing the view from the cabin's single window, the rain-swept pines and the dark, brooding face of the mountain. He wasn't just copying the scene. He was capturing its mood, the wild, somber beauty of it. She, who knew this land as a place of danger and concealment, saw it through his eyes for a moment as something else entirely. Something beautiful. "You see things," she said, her voice startling him. He looked up, a flush creeping up his neck. "It's a habit. It helps me to understand a place." He gestured to the drawing. "There is a harshness here, but there is a balance, too, an order to it." She looked from his drawing to the world outside. She had never thought of it as having an order, only a brutal indifference. That flicker of a different perspective, that quiet appreciation, was the first crack in the wall of her suspicion. It was a tiny, almost insignificant moment, but it shifted something between them. The air in the cabin felt a little less charged, a little more breathable. That evening the rain finally lessened to a drizzle. The next morning, a pale, watery sun broke through the clouds. As Maylin stood in the doorway, scanning the steaming landscape, she stiffened. Far down the valley, on the very edge of sight, was a rider. A single horseman, moving slowly, methodically, his head sweeping from side to side. He was searching. Her hand dropped to her hip, to the gun that was not there. The outside world, the world of bounties and barons, was coming for them. The quiet was over. The rider was too far away to be identified, but Maylin knew. She had seen men like him before, hired guns, trackers, the kind of men Baron Finch employed. They were patient, relentless, and they carried his authority like a weapon. "Get back inside," she said, her voice a low command. Thomas, who had come to stand behind her, saw the rigid line of her shoulders, the way her entire body had gone still and alert, like a deer sensing a wolf. He retreated into the cabin shadows without a word. Maylin did not move for a long time, watching as the rider eventually turned his horse and disappeared back the way he had come. He had not seen the cabin, not this time, but he would be back. The search had begun. She finally closed the door, the heavy wooden bar thudding into place with a sound of finality. She turned to face Thomas, her face a pale, grim mask in the dim light. "You need to tell me everything," she said. "About the family that sent for you, about the foreman, everything." Thomas, seeing the cold dread in her eyes, told her. He spoke of the letters from a woman named Eleanor Ellington, promising a quiet life, a partnership. He described the foreman, a brutish man with a sneer, who had met him at the stage stop in the dusty town of Prosperity. The foreman hadn't even let him get to the ranch. He had laughed, called him a scholar and a clerk, and said the Baron wouldn't have any use for a man with such soft hands. The name hung in the air between them, Baron Finch. "The Ellingtons are his tenants," Maylin stated. It wasn't a question. "He owns them, the ranch, the town, all of it." She walked to the hearth and stared into the low burning embers. The time for secrets was over. His presence was no longer just a risk. It was intertwined with the danger that had stalked her for years. 3 years ago," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "my family had a claim in the northern hills. We were surveyors, mapping a route for a new rail line. A small, independent line. Finch wanted that route for himself. He came with his men. He offered to buy the claim. My father refused." She paused, her hand rising to touch the faded brand on her other hand. "Finch doesn't like to be refused. He said if he couldn't buy it, he would take it, and everything on it." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which made the story all the more horrifying. "They burned our homestead. He marked me, like cattle, said I belonged to him now. I was the only one who got away." Thomas stared at her, at the proud, solitary woman who kept the world at arm's length, and finally understood. She wasn't just a fugitive. She was a survivor of a massacre, the sole witness to a crime a powerful man had tried to bury. And the brand on her hand was the mark of that man, a symbol of his monstrous ego. "He put a bounty on me," she finished, turning to look at him. Called me an outlaw, a murderer. Said I killed my own family. It was easier than admitting a 17-year-old girl escaped him. A chilling realization dawned on Thomas. The Ellingtons, he said slowly. Finch must have known about the arrangement. He could have stopped it at any time. But he let me travel 2,000 miles just to have his man turn me away at the end of it. It was a game to the Baron, a demonstration of his power, to summon a man from across the country and then discard him like trash, for no other reason than because he could. It was the same casual cruelty, the same assertion of ownership that had led him to brand a young girl. They were not two strangers who had happened to cross paths. They were two different victims of the same monster. The danger was no longer just hers. It was theirs. The rider in the valley was not just hunting for a ghost. He was hunting for the last person who could tell the truth about Alistair Finch. The immediate threat of the rider had passed, but a new tension settled in the cabin, sharper and more defined. They were no longer just a woman and her reluctant guest. They were allies, bound by a shared enemy. The knowledge changed the space between them. The silence was no longer awkward, but companionable. They moved around the small cabin with a growing awareness of each other, an unspoken rhythm developing. Maylin taught him how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, how to distinguish the track of a deer from that of an elk. In return, he brought a quiet order to her life. He took her jumbled collection of maps, some new, some old and brittle, and carefully repaired the torn ones with strips of gummed paper from his box. He organized her small stash of books, mostly almanacs and worn dime novels, into a neat row on a shelf. He had a way of creating order out of chaos that she found strangely calming. One evening, she returned from checking her snares, a brace of rabbits slung over her shoulder, to find him sitting at the table, a whetstone in his hand, patiently honing the edge of her largest skinning knife. The firelight caught the focused, serious set of his jaw. He looked up as she entered, offering a small, hesitant smile. "I thought it could be sharper," he said. She took the knife from him, testing the edge with her thumb. It was perfect. "You did good," she said, the praise feeling foreign on her tongue. It was in these small moments that the walls between them continued to crumble. She began to see the strength beneath his scholarly exterior, a resilient core that had allowed him to walk into a storm with his dignity, if not his pride, intact. He in turn saw past the fearsome reputation of the ghost to the wary, wounded woman beneath. He saw the way she would sometimes stare into the fire, her hand unconsciously tracing the scar Finch had given her, her face hardening into a mask of cold fury. One night he found her doing just that. She was sitting on the floor by the hearth, meticulously cleaning her twin colts, the metallic scent of gun oil filling the air. Her movements were sharp, angry. He could feel the rage radiating from her like heat. He sat down quietly near her, not speaking for a long time. Finally, he reached out and gently took the oilcloth from her hand. Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light, but she didn't pull away. His touch was feather light, his fingers barely brushing hers. "You don't have to carry it all alone," he murmured, his voice low and soft. "Let me help." He didn't know what he was offering, not really. He couldn't fight her battles for her, but he could sit with her in the dark. He could share the weight of the silence. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and let him take the cloth. He began to wipe down the barrel of the pistol she had been working on, his movements careful and deliberate. It was the most intimate gesture that had ever passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the trust that had grown in the heart of the storm. The fragile peace was shattered a week later. Mei Lin was on a high ridge overlooking the valley, tracking a buck, when she saw them. A column of riders, at least 10 of them, moving with grim purpose up the main track. At their head was a man on a fine gray stallion, a man who sat his saddle with an arrogant stiffness. Even from this distance, she recognized the immaculate cut of his coat, the confident tilt of his hat. Baron Alistair Finch. He had come himself. A cold, sick dread washed over her. They were moving too confidently, heading directly for her valley. Someone had talked. A trapper she'd traded pelts with? A prospector passing through? Then the realization hit her, cold and sharp. The town. Prosperity. The provisioner where Thomas had likely bought a few supplies before being cast out. Someone there must have put 2 and 2 together. A stranger asking about the Ellingtons, followed by rumors of the ghost. A $10 tip from Finch's foreman would loosen any tongue. She raced back to the cabin, her heart pounding against her ribs. She burst through the door, her face pale. "He's here," she said, her voice tight. "Finch, with a posse. They know where we are." Thomas looked up from the map he was studying. He saw the panic warring with fury in her eyes. "How?" "It doesn't matter how," she snapped, already moving, pulling her rifle from its pegs, checking the action. "We have to go. Now." Her plan was simple. Run. Lead them on a chase into the high passes, through the treacherous, broken country she knew better than anyone. She could lose them there, vanish as she had done before. Thomas watched her, his mind racing. He looked at the frantic energy with which she gathered supplies, the hunted look that was back in her eyes. This was her pattern. Run, hide, survive. But it wouldn't end. Finch would never stop. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Mei Lin froze, turning to stare at him. "What did you say?" "We don't run," he repeated, standing up. "They left me to die in a storm. I found my shelter here. I will not abandon it." His calm was a shocking contrast to her urgency. "You don't understand," she hissed. "These are killers." "And we're survivors," he countered, his gaze unwavering. "You've been running for 3 years, Mei Lin. Has it worked?" "He's still coming." He walked over to his wooden box, the one he had clutched so desperately in the storm. He opened the lid. She had assumed it held only books and clothes. But nestled amongst them, wrapped in velvet cloth, was a set of exquisite German-made cartography tools. Compasses, dividers, ruling pens. "My father was a map maker for the army," Thomas said, laying the tools out on the table. "He taught me everything he knew. You know the land by instinct. I know it by mathematics, by elevation and line of sight." He unrolled one of her maps, the one showing the terrain surrounding the valley. "Running is what he expects. He's flushing you out. But you know the weaknesses in this land better than he does. The rock slides, the narrow passes. We don't have to outrun them. We just have to outthink them." For the first time, Mei Lin saw a path forward that wasn't simply flight. He wasn't telling her what to do. He was offering her a new weapon. One forged from ink and paper, from logic and reason. It was a language she didn't speak, but one she could see the power in. Hope, she realized, was not just a feeling, it was a plan. They worked through the night, the lantern light casting their long shadows against the log walls. Mei Lin, her voice low and urgent, described every canyon, every game trail, every treacherous scree slope. Thomas listened, his pen scratching across a fresh sheet of paper, translating her intimate knowledge of the land into precise lines and angles. He calculated sight lines, identified choke points, and marked potential deadfalls. He was no longer a lost scholar. He was a military strategist, his mind a sharp, analytical instrument. Their plan was audacious. They would not flee. They would make their stand at a place Mei Lin called the Jagged Maw, a narrow gorge where the trail was barely wide enough for a single horse. with sheer rock walls on one side and a precipitous drop on the other. "There's a section of the cliff face high up," she explained, her finger tracing a line on his new map. "It's all loose shale. A loud enough noise, a few well-placed shots. Could trigger a rock slide," Thomas finished, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "We can trap them, split their force." It was a desperate gamble, but it was better than running. As dawn broke, they were ready. They packed only what was essential: weapons, ammunition, water, and Thomas's map. Maylin paused at the door, taking one last look at the cabin that had been her sanctuary. It might be a pile of ash by nightfall. Thomas came to stand beside her. "It's just wood and stone," he said gently. "We'll build another." She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. They slipped out into the pre-dawn gloom, Shadow moving like a wraith through the pines. They reached the jagged maw hours before Finch's posse, taking up a position high on the ridge overlooking the trail. From their vantage point, they could see the posse enter the gorge, their progress slow and cautious. Finch was in the lead, his arrogance plain to see. His men followed, strung out in a long line. They waited, their nerves stretched taut, until half the men were past the point they had marked for the rock slide. "Now," Maylin whispered. She raised her Winchester, took careful aim at the designated spot on the cliff face, and fired. The shot echoed through the gorge like a thunderclap. Thomas fired his own pistol, aiming near the same spot. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, a section of the rock face began to shift. Small pebbles gave way to larger rocks, and then the entire cliff seemed to dissolve into a roaring, churning river of stone and dust, crashing down onto the trail below. The posse was split in two. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted in panic and confusion. Finch and the 4 men with him were trapped on one side, the rest of his force cut off on the other. Gunfire erupted. Finch's men, recovering from the shock, began firing wildly up at the ridge. Bullets whined past Maylin and Thomas, chipping fragments of rock around them. Maylin returned fire, not with wild panic, but with the cold, deadly precision of a master gunslinger. Her shots were not wasted. One of Finch's men cried out and fell from his saddle. Another clutched his arm, his rifle clattering to the ground. Thomas, his face pale but determined, reloaded his pistol, firing not at the men, but at the rocks near them, creating diversions, keeping their heads down. In the chaos, Maylin saw a rifleman taking aim at Thomas. Without thinking, she shoved him hard, pushing him flat behind a boulder. A fraction of a second later, a searing pain exploded in her left shoulder. She gasped, stumbling back, the world tilting sickeningly. The bullet had torn through the muscle, a glancing but brutal wound. Thomas scrambled to her side, his face a mask of horror and fury. "Maylin!" He ripped a strip from his own shirt and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound, his gentle hands now surprisingly strong. He dragged her further back into the cover of the rocks, shielding her with his own body. The scholar was gone. In his place was a man defending his home, his partner, his entire world. The rock slide had been a success, but they were still pinned down. Finch, his face contorted with rage, was directing his remaining 3 men, using the chaos to his advantage. They were slowly advancing, moving from cover to cover up the treacherous slope. Maylin, propped against a rock, tried to raise her rifle, but a wave of dizziness and pain forced her to lower it. Blood was soaking through the makeshift bandage. "I can't get a clear shot," she gritted out, her voice strained. Thomas looked from her pale face to the advancing men. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. But then he saw the map, lying on the ground where it had fallen. He saw the lines he had drawn, the elevations he had calculated. He wasn't a gunman, but he was a map maker. He knew the terrain. "The echo," he said, his voice urgent. "You told me about the echo in this gorge." Maylin looked at him confused. "What?" "A single shot can sound like it's coming from everywhere at once," he explained, his mind working furiously. "Give me your pistol." She hesitated for only a second before handing it to him. He was a terrible shot, but his plan wasn't about accuracy. He scrambled to a different position, 20 yards away, and fired a single shot into the rock wall on the opposite side of the gorge. The sound ricocheted, a sharp crack that seemed to come from all directions. Finch's men faltered, looking around in confusion, unsure where the new threat was. Thomas scrambled again, firing from another spot. Panic began to set in among Finch's men. They thought they were surrounded. "It's a trick!" Finch roared, his voice raw with fury. He alone seemed to understand what was happening. Enraged at his men's incompetence, he broke cover, striding forward, his own silver-inlaid revolver in his hand. "She's wounded! She's up there! Alone!" He would finish this himself. He spotted their position, the dark shape of Mei Lin slumped against the rock, Thomas beside her. A triumphant, cruel smile spread across his face. He raised his pistol, taking aim. At that exact moment, a low, guttural growl echoed from the ridge above them. It was a sound that belonged to the mountain itself, ancient and filled with predatory power. Finch froze, his head snapping up. On a ledge directly above him stood a massive mountain lion, its muscles coiled, its yellow eyes fixed on the man who had disturbed its territory with his noise and violence. The cougar let out another soul-shaking roar. Finch, his arrogance finally shattering, stumbled backward in pure terror. His heel caught on a loose rock. His arms pinwheeled for a moment against the sky, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. And then he was gone, tumbling over the edge of the gorge into the abyss below. His scream was cut short by the unforgiving rocks. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of the wind. Finch's remaining men, leaderless and terrified, scrambled back to their horses and fled. Nature, the true ruler of this land, had delivered the final, impartial judgment. Mei Lin sagged against Thomas, the last of her strength giving out. He gathered her into his arms, holding her tight, his cheek pressed against her hair. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's all over. You're safe." She looked up at him, her vision blurring. In his eyes she saw not pity, but a fierce, protective love. The storm was finally over. Months passed. The autumn sun slanted across the valley, turning the aspen groves to rivers of gold. The bounty on the Ghost of the Divide vanished with the news of Baron Finch's demise. His death officially ruled a tragic accident. Without his iron will and bottomless greed to drive them, his hired guns and corrupt foremen scattered to the winds, his empire crumbling into rumor and dust. The cabin was no longer a hideout. It was a home. Thomas had added a new room, a small workshop with a wide window that flooded the space with light. Here he worked on his maps and his books, his hands finding their true purpose. The crude furniture had been replaced by pieces he had carefully crafted himself. There were shelves filled with books, not just his, but ones they had ordered from a catalog, brought in by a friendly mail carrier who now made the trip to their valley once a month. The cabin smelled of pine, wood smoke, and the leather and glue of Thomas's trade. The Winchester and the shotguns still hung by the hearth, but the twin Colts were now kept in a locked chest. They were tools, not decorations, and their work was done. Mei Lin's shoulder had healed, leaving behind a clean white scar that she now bore not with shame, but with a quiet pride. It was a mirror to the scar on her hand, a matching testament to a past she had survived, not fled from. She still hunted, her skills as sharp as ever, but she moved through the woods with a new lightness. She was no longer a ghost, but a woman walking her own land. She returned to the cabin one afternoon, a string of fish in her hand, to find Thomas at his workbench, sketching a new map of the region. one that would be more accurate than any that had come before. He looked up as she entered, and a slow smile spread across his face. It was a smile she had come to know better than the back of her own hand. "Good catch," he said. "I was just thinking about trout for dinner," she replied, her own smile coming easily. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. They had built this life together, not from a mail-order promise or a legal deed, but from the wreckage of two broken beginnings. They had found each other in a storm, two outcasts discarded by the world, and in the quiet sanctuary of the mountains they had forged a bond stronger than any steel. It was a love born not of flowery words or grand gestures, but of shared danger, mutual respect, and the quiet, steady work of building a home day by day. He set down his pen and came to her, taking the fish from her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, and the simple touch held all the promises they would ever need. Outside, the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The mountains that had once been her prison were now the walls of her sanctuary, a kingdom of two they had claimed for their own. The story of Maylin and Thomas is a powerful reminder that sometimes the lives we end up with are built from the pieces of the lives that were taken from us. It shows that strength isn't just about how well you can fight, but about how you endure, how you adapt, and how you find the courage to trust another soul in a world that has given you every reason not to. Theirs is a story forged in the heart of the American frontier, where survival often depended on the person standing beside you. If you found their journey as moving as I did, please give this video a like and consider sharing it with someone who appreciates a story of resilience and unexpected love. For more tales from the Untamed West, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments below, tell me, what do you believe is the single most important quality for surviving on the frontier? Was it strength, intelligence, or something else entirely? I look forward to reading your thoughts.